The third poem I'm going to share with you is in my third collection, Resurrection of a Black Man, which is dedicated to my brother and which contains 3 prize-winning poems. In this book, I try to create work that shows black men as complex, multi-dimensional individuals, as opposed to the limited and often violent stereotypes that are so prevalent in mainstream society. As with many of my poems, I don't know exactly where the inspiration came from for the poem Black Rapunzel, but the title clearly alludes to the fairy tale attributed to the Grimm brothers. In the most well-known version, a young girl is imprisoned in a tower by a wicked witch and cannot escape until she uses her long hair to climb down and free herself. Before this happens, we meet an heroic prince, and the happy ending is very far away from my poem, but there might be ways in which they overlap. I'll read the poem first and then try to point out some ideas I hope are of interest. Black Rapunzel. Family gathers in my plats, each parting like a grave for people forced to work the cane, colour of my scalp, sun beating on their crowns. I'll twist the strands into a rope, decolonizing hair, a diaspora wending back to help the ones in chains escape the transatlantic. Black Rapunzel, I'll uncoil my locks in prison yards, urge those on sus or sectioned, deep ancestor voices trapped in 2 loose plaits to shimmy over walls, hide beneath my head wrap, floral length of Africa before the trade. I'll carry them to safety, woven in my braids. We'll grieve till loss flies out, unbound at last. The first stanza begins, family gathers in my plats, a reference to the displacement black families suffered because of enslavement. In the case of black British families of Caribbean origin, this was from the African continent to the Caribbean, and then from the Caribbean to the UK. This double displacement could also be called a fracturing, which some would argue has led to transgenerational trauma. This can be described as occurring when an individual is emotionally overloaded by an external event for which they were unprepared. The devastating violence of enslavement could never be prepared for or sufficiently healed when it lasted for centuries and deliberately impoverished so many black people. Even when they were apparently emancipated, they still found themselves without land or any financial compensation. This was particularly unjust, as former enslavers not only kept their land, but were given financial compensation for the loss of enslaved labour. The first stanza of the poem references this history in the lines, "For people forced to work the cane, colour of my scalp." I use the image of plaits because black people's hair has been universally denigrated and held up as inferior to white people's hair for centuries, often seen as a symbol of wildness and an uncivilized mess. In her critically acclaimed non-fiction book, Don't Touch My Hair, Dabiri examines the way black people's hair has been stigmatized as a way to justify racism. She writes movingly, "From my earliest memories, my hair was presented as a problem that needed to be managed. The deeply entrenched idea of managing black women's hair operates as a powerful metaphor for societal control over our bodies at both micro and macro levels. Whether it's historic bondage during the transatlantic slave trade, or indeed the attitude of the education system, the thousands of black women held in immigration detention centres today, or the disproportionate number of black women in prison. In the US, black women are incarcerated at 4 times the rate of white women. Our bodily autonomy cannot be assumed." In my poem, I want to try and reclaim black people's hair as beautiful and as something that offers a chance for healing. But there's also a recognition of the damage that has been done to black identity in the line, "sun beating on their crowns." The word crown suggests something regal, but the sun, which is a symbol of vibrancy, also did untold damage. As I said earlier, the average life expectancy of enslaved people was only 7 years. This was as a result of violent and harsh conditions, a lack of food and long hours spent working in baking temperatures. It might also have been related to the deep grief enslaved people must have felt at being imprisoned in a barbaric system that was sanctioned by the British government. The third stanza of the poem, "I'll uncoil my locks in prison yards," refers to the disproportionate number of black people held in British jails. According to an article in The Guardian in 2019, black and minority ethnic young men make up over half the prison population, whilst only representing about 14% of the general population in the UK. This could be seen as indicating there is systemic racism in the criminal justice system. But whatever the truth, I wanted to address this issue and attempt to offer some sort of healing. I also wanted to do this when it comes to the number of black people who are judged to have mental health issues and who are forcibly detained. According to a recent government report, black people are 5 times as likely to be sectioned as white people. This is a shocking figure and suggests black people are all too easily dismissed as violent, angry offenders. In the poem, I long to offer escape to those who have been wrongly detained as a way of healing myself. The mention of my head wrap is very personal, but also references the African continent and an imagined time before transatlantic enslavement, where the vulnerable could be carried to safety woven in my braids. It is an idealized picture, but also perhaps a way to imagine the possibility of healing through mass grieving, a coming together that leads to a cleansing of the collective mind.